The evening sky wore the color of burnt copper, clouds trailing low across the horizon as if burdened by secrets too heavy to carry. Dust clung to the air and settled on the wood rails of the corral, where the horse stood waiting, a shadow of muscle and rage. Its eyes were bright as fire in the dim light, ears pinned back, chest rising in uneven heaves. Men at the saloon door whispered what had become common knowledge. That beast would kill the cowboy who dared touch it. He heard them, of course. The rancher always did. He had learned long ago that silence carried more weight than a dozen words, so he let their talk pass through him like wind through dead grass. His boots pressed steady into the dirt as he approached the fence, the sag of his shoulders a quiet echo of the years he had endured. A faded scar split one eyebrow, giving him the look of someone who had seen both sides of mercy and violence. His name, though few spoke it aloud anymore, was Daniel. Daniel had lived alone on the edge of the prairie for longer than most could remember. The small cabin bore the mark of a craftsman's hand, each beam set with care, though neglect had weathered the paint to gray. Inside, his table held 2 tin cups, though he drank from only one. The other remained untouched, a gesture stubborn in its persistence, as if waiting for someone who would never again sit across from him. When word spread that a wild Mustang had been dragged down from the ridges, half mad from hunger and iron ropes, Daniel had not turned away. The townsfolk laughed when they saw the animal delivered to his gate. "It'll trample him before sunrise," they said, wagering bottles and coins. The horse bore scars down its flank like claw marks from some unseen hand, its eyes a mirror of raw distrust. It stood as if made of fury itself, bound only by a rope that looked ready to snap. Daniel studied it with a stillness that unsettled the men who watched. He recognized something in that restless shifting of hooves, in the nostrils that flared at the scent of human nearness. Pain had written itself into the horse's body, just as it had into his own life. It was not the threat of death that moved him closer, but the familiarity of survival. At twilight, when the horizon throbbed with the last light of day, he stepped into the corral. The gate creaked open, then closed with a hollow clang. The air tightened, the silence heavy enough to make the bystanders lean forward. The horse's head snapped up, ears cutting the dusk. Every muscle rippled, charged like a bowstring. Daniel's hand brushed the air near its neck, no closer than a whisper. The Mustang struck like lightning. Its hooves lashed out, grazing his ribs with a force that sent him stumbling back against the rail. Pain tore through him, sharp and immediate. He caught his breath in ragged bursts, but he did not raise his fist nor reach for the rope. Instead, he steadied himself and stepped away, leaving the animal to its fury. Behind him, laughter rose from the men outside the fence. He did not turn to answer them. Later, in the cabin's dim light, he stripped his shirt and bound his side with rough linen, each movement slow with ache. He set the second tin cup on the table as always, then lowered himself onto the bench. The room smelled of smoke and dust, of years gone unspoken. From a wooden box tucked beneath the bed, he drew out a letter, the paper softened by time and folded too many times to count. The handwriting slanted gentle across the page. He read the same line he always returned to. "Don't give up on the living." His thumb lingered on the ink until the lantern hissed low, the flame shrinking to a glow. He closed the letter, slid it back into its place, and let the silence gather. Outside, the horse shifted in the corral, its hooves drumming against the earth like an echo of a promise yet unkept. Daniel leaned back, his hand resting on the bandage at his side. The pain did not matter. What mattered was the faint stirring he felt, something like recognition. He knew the horse had not come to kill him. Not yet. But he also knew tomorrow would bring him back into that corral, because sometimes the only way to honor the past was to risk being broken again. And in that quiet resolve, the story had only just begun. Morning came without warmth. The prairie stretched under a sky pale as bone, the wind cutting across the grass in thin, merciless strokes. Daniel rose stiffly, every breath reminding him of the bruise blooming along his ribs. Yet his steps carried him back to the corral, as though pain itself had become the ritual. The horse waited there, nostrils smoking in the chill, muscles shifting restlessly beneath a scarred hide. Its gaze was unblinking, the kind of stare that measured a man not for what he pretended to be, but for what he had endured. Neighbors passed along the road, pausing long enough to smirk. "Still alive?" one called, his tone dripping with disbelief. Daniel said nothing, his hand resting on the top rail, his silence harder than any answer. He had grown used to their judgment, used to the easy cruelty of men who had never carried real loss. The Mustang's distrust mirrored their scorn, yet in the animal's fury there was no malice. Only survival sharpened into a blade. He spent the morning mending the broken fence line, his hammer echoing through the empty land. Sweat mingled with dust despite the cold, his movements steady, deliberate. From the corner of his eye he could feel the horse watching, its ears twitching at each strike of iron. By afternoon he carried water to the corral, setting the bucket just beyond reach, then stepping back. The Mustang approached slowly, head lowered, every line of its body tense. It drank, but its eyes never left him, as if certain this was a trap. Daniel held his ground, offering no touch, no rope, only space. Days blurred into one another, each one edged with the same test. He brought hay, water, and patience. Sometimes the horse paced the rail until sweat darkened its coat. Other times it stood motionless, ears flicking at sounds only it could hear. Daniel learned to match its rhythm, approaching not with dominance, but with quiet repetition. His body still carried the ache of that first encounter, but his will was steadier than before. One evening, thunder rolled low over the plains, a sound that pressed against the earth with gathering weight. Clouds swelled dark, and lightning clawed at the distance. The Mustang grew restless, tossing its head, hooves cutting trenches into the dirt. Daniel felt the change in the air, the storm swelling like a wound about to burst. When the first sheet of rain struck, the horse bolted, rearing against the corral until the gates snapped wide. Daniel gave chase without hesitation, boots sinking into mud as he ran. The storm tore at him, rain stinging his face, wind shoving against his chest. Ahead, the Mustang's pale form flickered in lightning's glare, careening toward the ravine where water roared thick with flood. His ribs screamed with every step, but he pressed on, driven by something deeper than reason. At the edge of the ravine, he found the horse trapped between terror and collapse, hooves sliding near the drop. Water churned below, swollen and violent. Daniel slowed, lifting his hands into the storm-lit air, his voice low and steady. He spoke not commands but fragments of memory, words meant more for himself than for the animal. "Easy now. We've both lost enough." For a breathless moment, the Mustang's body held rigid, eyes wild with the choice of fight or fall. Then, with a shudder that rippled through muscle and bone, it stepped back from the brink. Daniel exhaled, the storm swallowing his relief. He reached no closer, only stood beside it in the downpour, his presence a fragile tether stronger than any rope. Together they walked back through the mud and rain, neither leading nor following, just moving side by side. By the time they reached the barn, both were soaked and shivering. Daniel draped an old blanket across the Mustang's shoulders, the gesture clumsy yet earnest. The animal did not strike, did not recoil. Instead, it lowered its head, the faintest concession of trust. He whispered a name then, a single syllable carried into the storm's fading echo. Ash. The word hung in the damp air, as much a prayer as a promise, binding man and horse in something the world outside could not yet understand. The days that followed softened, not in ease but in rhythm. Daniel moved through his chores with the quiet company of the horse never far from sight. Ash no longer pressed against the corral as if it were a cage. Instead, he stood still when Daniel approached, the restless fury of before tempered into wary endurance. Each small step carried weight. The crunch of hay spread in the trough, the scrape of a brush over mud-caked hide, the silence between them that stretched not as threat but as recognition. Daniel kept his movements deliberate, hands steady even when his ribs still ached with memory. He found that words came easier in the barn, where shadows softened the hard edges of his solitude. At first, he spoke only fragments, observations about the weather, murmurs about the day's labor, but soon his voice wove longer threads. He read aloud from the letters he carried, the ones folded so thin the ink had begun to blur. They were written by the woman who had once filled the cabin's second chair, her script tilted and graceful, filled with gentleness he thought had vanished with her. Ash would flick his ears, shifting at the sound, sometimes snorting in impatience, sometimes simply listening. Daniel never pretended the horse understood the words, but there was solace in the act of speaking them aloud, in sharing the letters with something alive. The barn grew to feel less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary, each syllable stitching a fragile thread between grief and present breath. One afternoon, as light angled gold through the slats, Daniel rested his hand flat on Ash's shoulder. The horse stiffened, muscles taut, but did not pull away. It was a moment that felt like the slow cracking of ice after a long winter, imperceptible yet undeniable. He let his hand linger only a heartbeat before stepping back, leaving space as if to prove he would not demand more than was given. But trust, like weather, could shift without warning. A boy from a neighboring ranch, drawn by curiosity and emboldened by whispers of the killer Mustang, crept into the yard. His boots startled Ash, who reared in panic, hooves lashing against wood until splinters flew. Daniel rushed forward, pulling the boy clear just as the horse crashed against the stall, snapping a beam. Pain flared through Daniel's shoulder as he landed hard in the dirt. The air ripped from his lungs. The boy fled, shame red on his face, but the damage lingered. Ash stood trembling, wild-eyed once more, the fragile trust shattered like glass. Daniel rose slowly, clutching his arm, doubt pressing heavy on him. He had gambled weeks of patience, only to find himself back at the beginning. Alone that night, he considered letting go, selling the animal, surrendering to the judgment of those who had always said this bond was impossible. The cabin's silence thickened until it felt suffocating. At dawn, he walked back to the corral, weary and braced for more distance. Yet Ash surprised him. The Mustang stepped forward without coaxing, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed Daniel's sleeve. It was not affection, not surrender, but something rawer, a wordless recognition that neither could walk away. Daniel pressed his palm gently against the warm hide, his throat tightening with unspoken relief. For the first time, the horse allowed the touch without flinch or fury. The gesture was simple, almost fleeting, but it carried the weight of every wound and every night spent alone. In that quiet morning light, with dust rising in soft motes and the land holding its breath, Daniel realized their struggle was no longer against each other, but against the world that believed they could not endure. And as Ash's steady breath warmed the chill from his hand, he knew the story between them was still unfolding, bound not by rope but by something stronger than fear. Storms had a way of returning to the prairie, as if the land itself refused to let men or beasts forget their fragility. On the night it came, the sky collapsed with thunder, and rain swept across the fields in furious sheets. Daniel woke to the shattering sound of splintering wood. The fence had given way, and his cattle poured into the darkness like a flood of shadows. Without them, his living would vanish. Without them, the ranch itself would collapse into ruin. He ran into the storm, breath ragged, boots sucked into mud with every step. Lightning tore the night wide enough to reveal the chaos. Cattle surging toward the ravine, eyes wide with terror, horns catching the glint of fire from the heavens. In the corral, Ash reared, wild but not untouchable, his body taut with the same fear that gripped the herd. Daniel knew he had no choice. He flung open the gate. Every muscle braced for betrayal. For an instant the horse lunged against the storm, as if ready to bolt into the dark. But when Daniel gripped the mane and swung himself onto the broad back, something astonishing happened. Ash held steady. The power beneath him was dangerous, unbroken, yet it did not throw him. Instead, the horse surged forward into the storm with a strength that felt both terrifying and holy. Mud sprayed up in violent arcs as they charged across the prairie. Daniel clung tight, ribs screaming, heart pounding not from fear of falling, but from the enormity of what had been given. Together they cut through the panicked herd, Ash driving them away from the ravine with snorts like thunder of his own. The cattle turned, guided by something beyond human command, as if the wild horse himself had become their leader. Villagers had gathered along the ridge, lanterns bobbing in the storm's teeth. They watched in disbelief as man and Mustang moved as one, turning disaster into a kind of salvation. Whispers replaced laughter. Awe replaced scorn. The horse they had sworn would kill Daniel was saving his life, his herd, and perhaps the very breath of his future. By the time the herd settled, scattered safely across higher ground, the storm was beginning to fade. Rain softened to drizzle, thunder to a low grumble in the distance. Daniel slid from Ash's back, knees buckling as his boots struck the sodden earth. He pressed his forehead briefly to the horse's damp neck, the heat of life radiating through soaked hide. It was not triumph that filled him, but gratitude too deep to speak aloud. When dawn arrived, the land bore scars from the night's violence. Fences broken, soil torn, cattle still restless. Yet in the barn stood Ash, calm beneath the weight of quiet mourning. Daniel brushed him with steady hands, each stroke a prayer of thanks. The old letters still lay in their wooden box, unread that day, because he no longer needed the words to remind him of what it meant to keep living. The presence before him was proof enough. At the table in the cabin, 2 tin cups remained, but for the first time the room did not feel hollow. The silence was companionable, no longer a wound. Daniel understood then that Ash had not come into his life as executioner, but as a kind of deliverance, a reminder that survival sometimes looked like trust disguised as danger. He stepped outside as the sun broke over the horizon, the world rinsed clean by rain. Ash stood beside him, head lifted toward the light. Daniel let the moment settle deep in his chest before whispering, more to himself than to the horse, "Sometimes the thing meant to break you is what saves you instead." And as the prairie stretched endless before them, a quiet certainty rooted itself in his heart. Their story had only begun, and it was already stronger than fear. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.